Welcome to the East Angle, a podcast about the East, broadly defined, exploring international relations, politics, and history. When time allows, we will also delve into world events and our shared passion for football. Hello, and welcome back to the East Angle for July's episode. And this month we have a fantastic and very expert and diverse group of guests who are going to discuss a very serious but very important topic, which is the war in Ukraine, its implications, its after effects. So to introduce those two fabulous guests, I'm going to hand over to Sherzod.
Thank you, Ra. This episode is, we are recording it in collaboration with the University of East Anglia's East Centre, and I'm very glad to have two East Centre members. I'm also, of course, a member of the East Centre, joining us on the East Angle podcast. I think it's quite fitting to have experts who work on the former Soviet Union, Eastern Europe, to just keep the horizons of our podcast as broad as possible. So I'm very happy to introduce our guests, Dr. Francis King, who is my good colleague at the School of History. We've worked together. We also co-teach on several modules, and it has been my pleasure to know Francis over the years. He's a lecturer in European history, and he's also co-director of the said East Centre, which is, the full name is UEA Centre for the Study of East, Central Europe and the former Soviet space. Our second guest is Dr. Olga Sovenko, who joined UEA as a research fellow under the British Academy grant in 2023 and has been an honorary lecturer in the School of AMA, which stands for Arts, Media and American Studies at the UEA. Before joining us, Olga worked at the Taras Shevchenko National University of Kiev, from which institution she also received her PhD, and her main interests are gender studies, media studies, socio-cultural analysis. So welcome, Francis and Olga, and thank you for joining us.
Hello.
Thank you.
So I'd like to get started with a very kind of fundamental question, and I'm going to throw this to Francis first, if that's okay. And that's really the why question. Why did the war in Ukraine start, and how can it be brought to an end?
The first question has to be, when did the war in Ukraine start? Because the conflict, the full-scale conflict that broke out in February 2022, or even the invasion of Crimea and the eastern part of Ukraine in 2014, has a prehistory. In other words, this is not something that sort of came out of the blue, and it's part of the unfinished business, if you like, of the way the Soviet Union itself broke up in 1991. It broke up along the existing Republican borders, but the Soviet Union was never actually constructed in order to break up. And so there were lots of ways in which the borders did not necessarily correspond to either ethnographic divisions or indeed cultural or kind of psychological divisions within the Soviet Union. And the remarkable thing about the process was how peaceful it was overall, considering what could have happened with an empire of that size breaking up. But the war in Ukraine has been something that has been, the crisis in Ukraine rather, something which has been simmering for some time. And I think it relates both to the nature of the Ukrainian Republic itself, as it existed in Soviet times and as it was established after 1991, as an area of quite diverse regions brought together in a very complex historical process. If you like, the greatest contrast, I would say, would be between the eastern and southern regions, which were annexed from the Ottoman Empire and its subject areas under Catherine the Great and around that sort of time, and the most western region around Lviv, which was never part of the Russian Empire and had been part of the Habsburg Empire and was annexed to the Soviet Union under Stalin. The Ukrainian language existed over this entire area. A sense of Ukrainianness existed over this entire area, but was interpreted in very different sorts of ways.
Sorry to interrupt you, Francis, but I can just like taking cue from what you've said already. Can I just add another question, and then of course feel free to return to the original question. But my question is, you mentioned unfinished business, and this is something we use in our teaching to our students. How much of what's going on currently, the whole crisis, is a result of unfinished business, and how much is it a result of active actions of Russian president and maybe other actors. So obviously you do go back in history, and you're presenting a very detailed panorama, if you like, of what actually the layers of history that lie underneath, which are really important. But how much is that causing the conflict, and how much are more recent developments and actions?
Well, another bit of business that was unfinished when the Soviet Union collapsed is what is the status of Russia? Because the Soviet Union was created on the basis of the Russian Empire. The Russian nation, the Russian state as a whole, was created as an empire. There had never been, if you like, as a polity, a Russian nation state. And when all the peripheral republics of the Soviet Union all went their own separate ways, the Russian Federation was in effect a kind of rump state. It was casting around, its leadership was casting around for its place in the world, its role. In the 1990s, in the general chaos of the Yeltsin period, with the influence of this pro-Western liberal elite which had taken power more or less after 1991, the question of Russia's place in the world wasn't really germane. The Russian patriots and nationalists could grumble about their kind of loss of status. There's nothing they could do about it because to a significant extent they remained a supplicant state. That has changed since 2000, and when Putin came to power very rapidly, it became clear that his overall aim was to kind of restore Russia's status as some kind of great power. Some kind of power in the world with which the other powers needed to recognise and take account of, and which had interests of its own. Above all, as a regional power in the former Soviet space. And this is, of course, where the issue of the tension with Ukraine and Ukraine's ruling elites comes in. The plans that Russia has for its role as this resurgent, regional, but nonetheless great power, and the plans that many in the Ukrainian political leadership have for Ukraine are fundamentally incompatible.
So does that mean it's unendable? There is no way to end it if you have this fundamental incompatibility. There's no way to end the conflict.
That it was inevitable, I think, to start with, and that it's, to add to what Ra said, that it's also very difficult to end. Is that fair?
Nothing in history is inevitable, and I think that with more intelligent handling, it needn't have got to where it's got to now. We'll probably come on to that later. But certainly there were these seeds of conflict right from the beginning, based not least on the perception amongst many of the Russian elite that somehow, as Putin put it, we were robbed. In other words, the way that the Bolsheviks had drawn the boundaries between the various Union republics, which were generally speaking ethnographically generous to the Union republics as part of the kind of the sweetener for being in the Soviet Union, meant that when the Soviet Union broke up, a very large part of the Russian nation, as perceived in Moscow, found itself living outside of Russia, and found itself living in polities whose need to define themselves involved, to a greater or lesser extent, a rejection of Russian things and of Russianness. In those circumstances, I think the potential for conflict is certainly there.
Thank you, Francis. This is a very helpful overview, I think, both historic but also more geopolitical, because the second part of your answer you mentioned what Russia actually makes of itself and what Putin specifically since 2000 has seen his country's role, or maybe his own mission, that he ties it in his own mission into it, that he wants to revive Russia and he wants to put Russia back to where it belongs in his eyes. But we have a Ukrainian scholar and a Ukrainian person, and as the only Ukrainian, Olga, I would like to ask you obviously about the war itself and how the war should be ended from the Ukrainian perspective. But before I ask you that question, maybe I can start building on what Francis said and ask you, how do the Ukrainian people view these processes? Do they share the perception that Ukraine's problems are part of the unfinished business or an unwanted legacy of the Soviet Union? Or are there other views on how the Ukrainian people have found themselves in this predicament? Because it's a horrible predicament. We didn't preface the podcast with what everybody understands and knows as we speak. People are dying, bombs are falling. Considering all of that, what do the Ukrainian intellectuals like yourself, or maybe just general public, how do they view the past 30 plus years of post-Soviet developments?
Well, I should say, like, I'm speaking as a citizen of Ukraine who has suffered from some of actions from Russia. When I'm having relatives in Russia and I'm having good friends, but this situation of war, which started from the local conflict, has touched all the Ukrainians all over the world. So I cannot say like we can speak only about the war which lasts for 2.5 years. Yeah, that's true that it is also having some roots in other historical moments and situations. It is really hard to observe the reality, and I should say that being a citizen of Ukraine but being born in Moscow, I was really depressed with the situation that we should protect ourselves from our neighbors, our brothers and sisters and our relatives who really don't believe that their troops are attacking Ukraine, making casualties among the citizens of Ukraine and so on. So it is still happening, and it is a split reality for all of us. So it is even hard to talk to some of the citizens of Ukraine when I'm abroad and they are still there. And that is the power of media, the power of anything like making opinion. Well, from my perspective, I can say Ukraine was a good dealing with its sovereignty, so it is an independent and progressive state which has the unique culture, which has everything that is needed to be a sovereign state, and has all the perspectives of developing itself as any states should develop. But being a neighbor of Russia, we of course are still having lots of influences coming from Russia, which are blooming even inside of Ukraine. So these are like Moscow Patriarch churches and the other actors who are dealing with the minds of people, who are constructing their opinions and so on. So that was a very unpredictable situation when all across the country we had such pro-Russian influences, which turned up to some people who live in Ukraine to doubt that Ukraine should still be sovereign and independent. So
Yeah, I have to say we don't doubt that Ukraine. I mean, I'm just saying that you started by reinforcing or reaffirming obviously for all of us that Ukraine is a sovereign state, which is, I understand, is a reaction to what Putin has been saying, or what Putin's government has been saying, that Ukraine never existed, etc., etc. All of these ahistorical pronouncements.
Sorry to cut in, Sherzod, but I guess the point here, or a big point to me, you talked about split reality, and this kind of brings forward the idea, especially as somebody that focuses on international relations, how can we improve the situation? I mean, I do have a massive respect for history, but there's a presence there. You have, you talked about having relatives in Russia and Ukraine, being born in Moscow, being a Ukrainian citizen. How do we get to a position of reconciliation between Ukraine and Russia, or the Ukrainian people and Russian people at this point?
the occupied territories of Ukraine for now are those who are the most inhabited by Russian-speaking population. So that means the people living there are already separated from the dominated part of Ukraine, and probably, yeah, they have lots of their inner problems, like to organize their life and to build their future, whether to try to escape to Ukraine or to stay somewhere in the occupied territories waiting for the deoccupation. But still, we have the results of the pollings, the surveys, which show us that the Ukrainian population is having the highest level of solidarity for now, and the social cohesion is really high. That means that having the situation of war, Ukrainians are coming back to their roots, so maintaining their culture and identity, going back to Ukrainian roots, and everybody, even being a foreigner in Ukraine, starting to speak Ukrainian, that really proves that is a strong position to keep your ethnicity, ethnic roots, and your culture, and it is the opposition of narratives which were coming from Russian propaganda that Ukraine cannot exist and Ukrainian language is not having the perspectives and so on. So that is true that our culture is even blooming now during the war. We have our theaters like full of spectators. We have our film production intensifying because we have this motivation to do more, to do better, and to keep our solidarity blooming. So that is the thing that could also be one of the points why we have so many motivated and patriotic people now.
Right. So is that, in that sense, you think deoccupation is a realistic achievement? All the territory that's been taken post 2014 by Russia, that given everything you've said, that can at some point be returned, and that Ukraine will see victory as a complete reclaiming of all of that land?
That is a question, because we have some governmental programs and plans, but of course it is very hard to talk about them now because they are only plans. If we have our territories back, and which would be our actions, how to reintegrate those people, that population. We cannot have the precise numbers, but we know that people from occupied territories are also moving to Russia, not only to Ukraine or elsewhere. So, you know, the composition of the population on the occupied territories changed a lot. We do not even can build this plan based on the numbers. So we do not have those numbers for now.
Yeah. One final question to you, and I will also ask the same question to Francis. I think just kind of building on from what Ra said, what would victory look like for Ukraine as a Ukrainian? Or maybe as a sociologist, because you work with lots of, you know, groups of people, specifically women, but you also are an expert in surveys and questionnaires and all the other, you know, methods through which sociologists actually measure opinions or measure certain trends in society. How do you feel, and how do the Ukrainians in their majority, or the people who you have actually sampled, feel victory should look like for Ukraine?
For now, still we are having the numbers that the most part of the population are still believing that we could have all of our territories since 1991 back. Of course, the victory cannot be a happy moment at all. It would be a very sad moment, having to realize what we have passed through and what we are having still to do. The whole structure of society has been ruined, and we are having lots of population in great despair for now. The level of mental disease is growing up to 50%. Mental health issues are a big trouble, of course. In this situation, we only suppose that the peaceful time will bring us much more challenges that we even have now during the war. So having the enemy, people are united, but having their other troubles of everyday life, having those victims of war, injured people, disabled people, the other challenges, that would be a hard period. And I know lots of platforms which are already discussing all those challenges, how to build any kind of action plan which can work, and how to bring people together, because we are having around 9 million people outside of Ukraine, even during those 2.5 years of the full-scale war. So only the half of them in our surveys are going to be back, but the others are very useful resource, because the diaspora and everybody abroad are still working for Ukraine, like making the image of Ukraine popularized and getting the support for Ukraine in any sphere where they can do.
Thank you. Francis, to take that question, maybe tweak it slightly. From your viewpoint, how realistic is it for Ukraine to aim for 1991 borders?
To be honest, I don't think it's remotely realistic. I mean, President Zelensky's set out what he regards as the criteria for Ukrainian victory, which is not only 1991 borders, but also bringing Putin and the other Russian leadership in front of a war crimes tribunal and large-scale reparations from Russia. In order to achieve that, and in his discussion with Viktor Orban, Zelensky kind of made this sort of point, you'd have to have effectively the collapse of the Russian state from within. I can see no realistic circumstance in which that could happen, short of the collapse of the Russian state from within and the assumption of power by people like the people who took it in 1991, who do not actually exist now in Russia. The kind of the pro-Western moment in Russia, I think, has gone. The liberals showed themselves to be interested in very little other than their own self-enrichment, etc., etc. So I really do not think that is a remotely realistic perspective. And we're in a war of attrition in which basically Russia has vastly more resources than Ukraine at its disposal. The talk of victory in those terms, barring unpredictable, unforeseeable calamity which could quite possibly be very dangerous for Russia's neighbours, I don't think it's really anything sort of worth kind of planning for or talking about.
So does that mean accepting pretty much the status quo as it is, freezing the conflict, for example?
Well, the war has got to be brought to an end somehow. Nobody wants it to escalate. Russia's nuclear sabre rattling has been precisely a warning to NATO, don't you try escalating it. And NATO shows no interest in getting involved in what would certainly be a massively destructive war, first and foremost for Ukraine. It'd be hard to see how much of that would be left after a full-scale confrontation between NATO and Russia. The problem with wars is that they're very easy to start. They're very easy to escalate. They're almost impossible to bring to an end on a satisfactory basis. That is always the most difficult thing. And the outcome of wars is invariably unpredictable when the war's actually going, and it's never to the taste of any of the warring parties. Those are things you have to bear in mind historically about wars at any time, and the same is here. Somehow the situation has to be de-escalated, and it's a very, very noticeable, it seems to me, that in the current diplomacy, the current international relations thing, the Western powers are constantly thinking of new sticks and are never talking about any carrots. The role of diplomacy is very much not only downplayed but decried, and anybody who tries it, for whatever reasons, tends to get denounced as an appeaser, rather than sort of Viktor Orban's recent kind of foray into Russia and Ukraine to try to talk to Putin and Zelensky and try to find some kind of solution. Rather than it being discussed on its merits and its realisticness, the dominant narrative in the Western media seems to be that this man is somehow, a traitor to the cause of the collective West. It's a profoundly unhealthy situation, which is full of dangers, first and foremost for the people of Ukraine and Eastern Europe.
Right, so I wonder if we could throw that back to you, Olga, and hearing that, I mean, is it the case that you think within Ukraine the desire is for the West, so-called, to go kind of all in and do everything to punish Russia, supply weapons, do what it can to push Russia out of as much Ukrainian territory as possible, and then freeze the conflict? Or is the expectation that Russia, as Francis alluded, could be actually destroyed as a state, and that would be the only way to reinstigate, the original borders and to give Ukrainian sovereignty back and give the Ukrainian people a chance to rebuild the nation?
I cannot talk so much about those perspectives as far as in Ukrainian media. Of course, they are discussed, but we cannot put such questions to the survey, to the questionnaire for the ordinary people, like if you want Russia to collapse. Yeah, of course, there's a big desire for anything that is threatening Ukrainians to be destroyed or to disappear. But the ordinary people just want the peaceful life. What is the condition for the peace? That could be anything that is guaranteeing stability and no weapons around. So, of course, it is a very hard decision to...
I mean, is there, for example, talk in Ukraine about, as there often is, in other sort of, certainly in academic circles, about the role of China or the role of the United States, how this is becoming a proxy war where prolonging the conflict is actually in the interest of actors like China. So it's beyond just Russia and Ukraine or doing something about Putin's aggression, but actually needing to engage with a much broader set of actors. Like, is that the common understanding, or are people, like you say, simply thinking there's a quicker solution to this? There's a way of protecting what we have and rebuilding, or does it have to have a much broader perspective to it?
Well, of course, the role of the major actors is discussed, and I cannot say that we pay attention to how much weapon is supplied from both sides, but of course it is an important question for the war analytics, but the population cannot really predict what will happen with the weapons from both sides, if they will be used in Ukraine. Just we understand that it is going to be a more threat to Ukrainian people and so on. So yes, the role of China is really a horror for Ukrainians, because we understand that Russia also is depending on China, and it is possible that if the both actors, major actors, dominant actors would be involved fully into the war, so that would be more and more casualties, especially in Ukraine. So it is also a big, horrible perspective for Ukrainians, because we are having our population who is suffering the most, not like the population of those countries, of course.
I think this is a time to take a quick break. Welcome back. I've been listening to you guys as you spoke about the geopolitics. Obviously, Francis and Ra talked about a perspective from the more global perspective, and Olga, you mentioned what the Ukrainian population thinks. I want to go back to Francis with the question, how much of all of that is also the West's making? Because, yes, we did mention China, and we will go back to China if we have time. And I am also mindful, looking at Olga, that, it probably, from a Ukrainian perspective, what we're doing here might actually sound a bit ridiculous, like some foreigners sitting and deciding things or discussing things that affect Ukrainians on a daily basis. And I say all of this with all the responsibility. But
true, but I just to interject on that, I would
Okay.
say that the war in Ukraine is affecting everyone. Of course, it's affecting Ukrainians more than anyone else, and it is mostly Ukrainians and Russians that are dying. But this is existential to the globe, certainly to Europe. So I think we have to bear that in mind. It's a really important topic, not just as an academic discussion, but because this threatens all of us.
absolutely right. Again, I am Uzbek, so as someone who comes from former Soviet Union, I have always said this to you, that Ukraine is fighting for everybody. Ukraine isn't just fighting for Ukraine. And it's really important, from also my background as coming from Central Asia, that Ukraine doesn't lose. Obviously, we have talked about what losing and winning might be, and we can argue until the cows come home, and I won't do that. But I do take your point. It's an important conflict for everybody, especially for the post-Soviet states. But to go back to Francis, we did talk about, and you did criticize in passing the Western media. Can we say that we shouldn't only look at what Russia has done, although what Russia has done is despicable and the decision that Putin has taken is unjustifiable? How would you then look at what's going on in the so-called Western public sphere and judge all of that?
I think a big problem, and we're seeing the same problem playing out in Georgia at the moment as well, is this compulsion we seem to have in the West of obliging would-be client states to choose. You must choose this side or you must choose that side, regardless of your geopolitical location, regardless of where you are on the map. Ukraine, prior to 2013, was a country which had a wide variety of psychological orientations amongst its people. Some looked more to Russia, some looked more to the West and that sort of thing. It was a very carefully balanced equilibrium. You could see it in Ukrainian election results. Sometimes it went to the orange side, sometimes it went to the blue side. Both we and Russia, both the EU, which we were part of at that time, and Russia, pushed Ukraine into this situation. You've got to choose. You choose either the EU or you choose the Eurasian Economic Union. That would prove disastrous for Ukraine. Faced with that choice, a political issue arose that could not be resolved within society by any kind of compromise. One side had to lose out, and we've seen the consequence of that. That, I think, is one of the major responsibilities of the West. Its kind of almost messianic role now of trying to sort of bring everybody into this kind of liberal democratic so-called American-run fold, and anybody who is outside it is, therefore beyond the pale. And you can see it now, particularly maybe I shouldn't be bringing Georgia into it at the moment, but the whole way that the...
Oh, please do. It's interesting.
The whole way that the Western and EU people particularly have told Georgia that if you introduce this law that we don't like about registering foreign agents and that sort of thing, your chances of joining us will be shattered. If you look at a map, Georgia has got Russia to the north of it, it's got Turkey to the southwest, it's got Iran to the southeast. You've got to have a relationship with all these people as well as with the West. We do not see that in trying to kind of dictate the geopolitical orientations of our would-be allies and client states. And this, I think, is if you like, the major culpability of the West. Ukraine, as it existed from 1991 to 2013, I think was a fragile and precious thing that really should have been not obliged to choose, not put in these situations where the very delicate policy there was going to crack and collapse.
So is that something where this could change? Could there be a change to the Western approach? For example, following an election in the United States, multiple elections, political turmoil in Europe, is that basic narrative of forcing these states to choose, is it possible that might be adjusted to something that's much more productive, much more constructive and future-oriented?
Well, if I could see any sensible politicians likely to win any elections in the West, then yes. Unfortunately, I do not see any such politicians. So I imagine that we're going to carry on in much the same way for the foreseeable future. It's very unfortunate. It feeds this whole kind of multipolarity sort of thing which Russia and to a lesser extent openly China is pushing. The reason why China, for example, has refused to go along with the Western-led sanctions regime against Russia is quite simple. China knows full well that the United States has its sights on China. Why the hell should China do something to strengthen the United States and its allies in their geopolitical aims in order then to see itself as the next, as they perceive it, victim of United States imperialism?
By the same logic, please do stop me if I'm hijacking your logic here or hijacking your point here, but by the same logic, Viktor Orban is also approaching Ukrainian situation with his nation's interests in mind, and each nation will, and again, going back to geopolitics from grad school, what I remember from geopolitics, Sir Halford Mackinder and all the others, talking about the fate of the Rimland, if you remember Rimland. And if you look at the Rimland, it's a crescent which kind of takes into itself partly places like Ukraine. Unfortunately, for smaller nations, again, I'm not saying that I subscribe to this viewpoint, but I also come from that so-called Rimland, that you have to really balance between big powers, and there's no other way. And I agree with you that they were balancing until 2013, and that fragile balance was kind of being kept. But on the other hand, and I might also turn again to Olga, why shouldn't the Ukrainian people choose for themselves? Why should we apply this centuries-old logic of geopolitics? Oh, you're a small nation, shut up and just do what the others say or what the big powers say. Why shouldn't Ukraine also, just like China is doing in its own national interest, just like Hungary and the so-called West is doing, why shouldn't Ukraine then decide for itself and be able to then protect that decision or to live with the outcome of that decision?
Well, it hasn't proved able to protect that decision. As a result of the way the politics have played out, Ukraine now finds itself in a far more dependent situation than ever it was before.
But is that how you view it, Olga, as well? Would you consider Ukraine to be dependent, and in that sense, in one sense, disempowered along the lines that Sherzod is saying? Or do you think it is possible for Ukraine to now galvanise and formulate its own policy, its own vision for the future?
Well, in this situation when we should fight, and it is a really cruel fight, the full-scale war, of course we are dependent a lot on the weapon supply and so on, but actually I should say our population was growing in its mind, like having the social consciousness maturing, and so by the time of 2013 it was obvious that the population could have its own decisions, could fight for their opinion, and so there was no perspective to go back to the USSR and to be so nostalgic for what was happening with Ukraine before. So the only perspective was to join and to have some European progressive values and to go further, like the business development and lots of connections with European countries would show us that we are gaining from this more than coming back to be dependent on Russian gas or anything else, like the other resources, and also the cultural ties. So we were not supposed like to break the old ties in the world, like with Russia and all the countries from our past maybe, but there is a good point to continue some rational use from the cultural background, but of course to maintain the idea that we have the value ourselves, so there is no way, no aim or goal to be dependent anymore, and it is natural because we are formulating our national identity and people are really confident in their future in Ukraine. So up to 94% are proud to be Ukrainians, even if they have different ethnic backgrounds, and that is the good number like to start with. So those points make us sure that to be an independent state, you should of course work hard. There is I should say the lack of professional management still in our country.
But
That is the reason that we cannot like have a good choice sometimes.
right, right.
We know about this, but still we are growing new leaders, and so that is the perspective. After having so many things to go through to pass the realities of war and so on, we are having the strong position and the new allies, new leaders. That is why I am sure that it is the good chance like to gain the strong position like the actor.
Sure. Okay.
And
I mean, I appreciate that perspective, and I think it sounds very, very positive and very hopeful. But if, without putting words back into your mouth, Francis, am I right in thinking that your view is that management process, that rebuilding process, is itself, in one sense, reliant now upon, shall we say, again, for want of a better word, mostly US, but Western interests?
Well, the country is not only being kept in the war by Western, gifts and loans, but much of its civil infrastructure and that sort of thing is also being financed. The state budget generally is also being financed by, again, gifts and loans. And we in the West do not give people large sums of money without expecting something back. And so I fear that Ukraine will find itself in the position of a supplicant state, more or less obliged to bend to the will of whatever the leadership of the United States wants from it for the foreseeable future. That's simply the harsh business reality.
I will also come back to on this question, and I will also come to Olga as an Uzbek, and I'm going to speak here as an Uzbek. You know what I think? It's better to be dependent on the West. I'm very curious. I know where you're coming from. Ukraine would have no chance, and Olga did make that point. It is dependent, but it would have lost already many times over without the Western help. But then more fundamentally, if you have to choose, and we kind of agreed or maybe disagreed to agree that Rimland countries have to choose, you just otherwise somebody else will choose for you. Then if you have to choose, I don't know, I grew up with that sense that I come from a small country that doesn't really have the resources to withstand pressure from someone like Russia. Yes, the US is powerful, but the US is also far away. Russia is not going anywhere. It's there, it's massive, and I always say, thank God Uzbekistan doesn't have a common border with Russia. But look at Kazakhstan. Look how nervous Kazakhs are now, because they have one of the world's longest borders with Russia. Just to finish my point, and I am talking for myself, although at the same time I agree that a lot of my compatriots would agree with me. If a choice, hard choice, had to be made, I would have chosen West all day, every day. But I'm also curious to know Olga's viewpoint and Francis's response.
For now, the choice is obvious. We are having some agreements about how Ukraine would develop after the war, and we hope for the as fast as possible finish of the war, the end of those actions. I am sure that for now we are developing really good connections with different countries, and that is not we are only connected to the EU countries, because we are also having our migrants there and also doing some loans from the European Union and so on, but also our specialists and our leaders all over the world, and that is really good position for now for the Ukrainian perspectives, because lots of things which can happen demand to have the positive image and also to have some private connections, even through the enterprises, through the business communities and so on. So I, and not only me, I'm sure that it is a good perspective to do more business and to develop more connections in the future. So of course I'm not an economist, and I cannot understand those numbers which are going to appear in the nearest future. What does it mean for Ukraine? But I saw the numbers that even during the war our business is working, and the GDP even had 2% of growth and so on. So we are developing international communications with global companies and so on. Also, I know the number that Ukrainians have established 30,000 enterprises in Poland during the last 2 years. So it is a big number, even to think about what does it mean for our cooperation in future, and what does it mean for the income for Ukraine and so on. I'm also aware Ukrainians are making good business in the UK, establishing new kinds of businesses and so on. So there are even a few business associations which have been established during those 2 years. So there is a good number of people who are very motivated to work and to have their business developed and to have the connections with Ukraine.
Thank you. It's good to know there is optimism. Francis?
Well, here's some pessimism then.
Okay, okay.
A small country, or relatively weak country, that is the neighbour of a large, powerful country that makes an enemy of that large, powerful country almost never thrives. It's extremely silly politics. It's just a bad idea throughout history. I think of very few examples where that's actually kind of been in the interests of that country. And I don't think that it's necessarily a choice of either you're an enemy of the big country or you subordinate yourself to it entirely. I mean, I'd also look, for example, at the example of Azerbaijan, which is a country which manoeuvres and triangulates and quadrangulates or whatever very effectively between Russia, Iran, Turkey, keeping good relations with the pro-Western regime in Georgia and that sort of thing. It's a very kind of active sort of diplomacy, requires a lot of clever footwork, but overall it succeeded in keeping that country sovereign, for better or for worse. It's, I think, the only thing which, if you are a small country that has the misfortune to be not in an island somewhere but actually next to a large one, the only thing you can actually sensibly do in order to preserve the maximum possible independence for yourself, the maximum possible freedom of manoeuvre. And if you kind of get pushed into a position of throwing yourself into the arms of one particular great power or another, then you have lost that independence. And the problem, of course, with that power being the West is that America is actually quite far away. That is one of the problems. And America, of course, has its own interests. There's been the talk about the discussions that took place in Istanbul in April 2022, in which agreement was almost reached between the Ukrainian and Russian negotiators, which would have kind of led to Ukraine implementing some version of Minsk II. Far from ideal, but vastly better than the situation Ukraine finds itself in now. And Boris Johnson goes over there and tells the Ukrainians that, if you sign this, we will not act as one of the guarantors, effectively torpedoing the whole thing. So Ukraine was led to believe, sure many people wanted to believe it, that it would be provided with the weapons to fight Russia and achieve an altogether more wonderful victory. Ukraine is now fighting Russia in the interests of the United States. In fact, it's now got to a situation where the idea of Ukraine losing is unconscionable, not because of what it would mean for the Ukrainians, because of what it would mean for NATO and for Western hubris and that sort of thing.
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly a very, very brutal, stark analysis. But thank you, Francis. It gives us a sense of the scale of the problems. We have so many more issues that we would love to discuss because they're super. We wanted to discuss issues of gender, issues of targeting sports people and the development of society. Unfortunately, we are running out of time on this edition of the podcast. So I think really all we have time to do is to throw the ball back to Olga and Francis one more time as our guests and ask them for their thoughts about what should happen next and maybe what might happen in the future. So we'll start with Olga.
As we are all concentrated on the upcoming elections in the US, even Ukrainians now are concerned about the results and what is going to happen. Also, the social thing like the temporary protection in the other countries for the Ukrainian refugees. The conditions are changing a bit, so Ukrainians, like ordinary citizens, are thinking about what should they do because some of them cannot be brought back to Ukraine, having their houses destroyed or just no space for living and so on. What we can say about the upcoming future, that is again the high level of splitting in our minds also. Ukrainians who live abroad travel to Ukraine, trying to support their families, everybody. The level of volunteering and donations is really, really high. And so it all continues, and we can see like some spheres in Ukraine are really developing and benefiting, and in some even parts of Ukraine you cannot imagine that the war is happening. So yeah, you have the electricity cuts, you have the air raid sirens, but still you are having the like normal life. Lots of those things are making the ordinary people think like, oh, we can still live in Ukraine and it will be okay. But of course we could think about the perspectives, like economic perspectives and the other social challenges, and some of the people who are abroad still have no perspective to come back in the nearest future. So we will have the lack of the labor forces. Of course, it is also very actual now because those people who are mobilized, they are serving in the army and they are the professionals of their sphere, so nobody is substituting them. There is a lack of professionals at the labor market. But also we are having more and more growing the level of patriotism again and again. So there are even some foreigners who are traveling to Ukraine even now, and even I'm aware of such cases which are thinking about how to establish any kind of business in Ukraine or doing some humanitarian missions and so on. So you know that is the good thing that we are having more and more friends in some kind of future perspective. They will be more. So they are going to travel to Ukraine. They are interested in Ukraine because we are everywhere in the news, you know, they want to know our culture, our people, what is in our minds and so on. And we are still having our culture growing and having exhibitions and everything like broadcasts everywhere in the world. That makes us a bit sure that having such hard times, we are still having the perspective for the bright future.
Sure. Thank you, Olga. So optimism again. Francis, I hope you're not going to
spoil the moment.
Go ahead.
Well, I think we need to bear in mind that when this is all over, we're all still living on the same landmass. Ukraine is not going away. Russia is not going away. All the other countries are not going away. And we've got to find some way of living together, cooperating and avoiding these sorts of situations in the future. What we need to avoid is this kind of culture of retribution, of moralizing, finger wagging, blaming and that sort of thing. You can keep a war or a conflict going for centuries if you carry on like that. When this is all over, when we are building for the future, we've got to think of ways in which we can reduce tensions on the continent. Not all gang up on each other or on one or another power. Because otherwise, this is just going to repeat itself again and again and again.
And I guess those are lessons from history.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I certainly would like to thank our two guests, Olga and Francis, hugely. It's been a fascinating conversation. Thank you very much, and thank you to my co-host, Sherzod.
Thank you, Olga. Thank you, Francis. Thank you, Ra. And thank you to brilliant Andy, who's helping us with the engineering. Certainly, we had some views, sometimes differing views, but I think we had a good conversation. Unfortunately, time is a fact, otherwise we would continue the discussion. But please stay tuned. To all our listeners who've listened until this point, please stay tuned, because there will be more interesting episodes to come. Once again, thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
This podcast has been produced with support from the Faculty of Arts and Humanities at the University of East Anglia, UEA. The hosts are grateful to the UEA media production team. Technical assistance has been kindly provided by the technicians at the UEA Media Suite, who have also engineered and edited this episode. The views expressed in this podcast belong solely to those who express them and do not represent the views of the university or its affiliates.